Hello, and welcome to Dig It. I'm Peter Brown, and hosting the show with me today is Chris Day. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Peter.
How are you?
Very well, Peter. How are you?
Yeah, I can't complain. Autumn is definitely here now, isn't it? First few frosty mornings have come through. The leaves are lovely at the moment. So looking out across the view from my house and seeing all the yellow and starting sort of reds, it's just glorious this time of the year, isn't it? It's a bit of a pain sweeping up all the leaves, but equally,
never-ending job, as we know, isn't it? But I invested in a new toy. I've got a vacuum cleaner now, which mulches. It lifts all the leaves up and it mulches, and I can put that on my compost heap. So
excellent.
I thought I'd do something for the environment, and hopefully it's going to save a bit of time as well.
Well, it's so much easier using mechanical things, isn't it? I mean, they're a bit more expensive than a rake, but they definitely do. I mean, we've got one here, a Greenworks battery-powered one at the garden centre, and I used that the other day. And other than when you sweep up the dust, which is not a good thing, you just get clouds of dust coming out of these things. But
indeed, yes.
they are amazing for helping with the leaves and sorting things out.
And as we've been chatting in previous podcasts about using leaf mould, I thought I'd better be a practitioner of my advice and do my own bit of leaf mould production. So I'm into 1.5 compost bins full of leaves, which I've put some compost activator on. I've done everything by the book.
Okay.
So I'm looking forward to some nice material for next spring, or maybe next summer for using as a mulch.
And can you use is that Garotta?
Yes, Garotta,
Garotta's the go-to there, is it?
That's it. That's the one to use.
Activator.
Really. Yes, indeed. Yeah, or a bit of dry blood, I think, is also advised too. So you can use that. So
okay,
yeah. So
cool.
yeah.
So today we're talking about trees, aren't we? And sort of small trees and trees for the modern garden.
Yes, and obviously we're into the tree planting season. I mean, we're busy at the garden centre now with trees starting to arrive bare roots and plotted. So it is the time to think about nature's natural planting time. And yes, we've got a really great guest lined up, and it will be hopefully a nice chat.
Yeah, because we've got Nick Dunn from Frank Matthews Trees, haven't we? Now, Frank Matthews Trees, I mean, they are...
Yeah, they're good.
They're the ones you want, aren't they? They've been at it quite a few years, and I'm really looking forward to this interview.
Yeah, I mean, we always get very excited at the garden centre when we get deliveries from Frank Matthews. I think because you just know that you're going to get some real gems of trees, and they're going to be grown really well. And of course, they come with an amazing label. You know, we talk about labels. I have this thing about labels. So many poor plants are labelled. Especially,
so many labels just don't tell you anything, or they just use a generic description and generic care conditions, and they're totally unsuitable for the plant that you're buying.
Yes,
it's something I know we as a garden centre have always made sure that not only do we leave the suppliers' labels on, we generally put our own on, and that has a description on what it's going to grow into, how to care for it, and all of those things. And Frank Matthews labels they're big, they're bold, they're colourful.
And they're packed with information which is so easy to use, and for customers who are buying, and let's think about it, buying a tree is quite a committed purchase, isn't it? You're going to be spending 60, 70, 80 pounds on something which is going to hopefully give you many, many years, many potentially generations of use. So you need to get it right, and a good advice label, absolutely key. And yes, good old Frank Matthews ticks all the boxes with their wonderful labels.
Okay, so shall we hear from him now?
Indeed. Hello, Nick, and welcome to Dig It. How do we find you today?
Oh, all good. Very well. Monday morning, weather's perfect, especially for lifting trees out of the ground. So, yes, we're very happy this morning. Yeah,
and I suspect the weather we're having at the moment is causing a few problems for you, maybe.
Well, not really. It's been quite dry, and although the leaf hasn't come off very easily, because that's what we benefit from, is a few frosty nights. We haven't had those, but we've had dry weather. Yeah. And the autumn colours actually been fair, considering it's usually enhanced by frost. I think it looks rather nice in places. I don't know what it's like your end.
Indeed, yeah, we've had I think 2 or 3 nights of frost over in North Buckinghamshire, but no, it's all good. So Nick, perhaps we can sort of set the scene for you. You're a third generation of growers. You've followed your father's and your grandfather's footsteps. Obviously, there's a bit of good old chlorophyll running in those good old veins, Nick. So can you set the scene and tell us about those early days at the nursery at Trees for Life, Frank P. Matthews?
Well, yes. I mean, if you wanted to go back to my grandfather's time, which I think is just worth pondering on for a little bit, he started in 1901. And of course, this was almost pre-machinery days, I would say. So horse and cart and manpower was very much the only way of growing trees and going about the business in those days. Interestingly, my grandfather was quite organic in his thinking. Okay. Although they used chemicals to whatever's available in those days, he was a great advocate of organic matter. And one of the interesting things is, because we were situated down at Heathrow, it was on the canal system. And it's well recorded that he used to bring all the horse manure out of the stables in London by barge, and it would be unloaded on the nursery where the canal was, and it was transferred onto the nursery by horse and cart. And he had a huge amounts of organic matter which he relied on to grow good quality trees.
That's I mean, yes, in these days, I suppose that's even more sort of pertinent, isn't it? How we should be looking to improve our soil quality, especially with, I don't know, soil erosion and such like. So, yeah, so that's
yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think soil will come into some of our discussion today about trees and gardens and so on, yeah. But those early days were obviously pioneering but we moved to Worcestershire on the Worcester-Hereford border here in the mid-50s. And that was when my father brought us to new soil, because the M4 construction in the late 50s went over the nursery land, sadly, at Heathrow. So that was the reason why we came here. And the only reason was because of the soil quality in the Team Valley, which is where we're situated.
Lovely.
But the growing technique of trees hasn't changed at all. The most important propagation techniques have not changed since my grandfather's time. We've obviously made life a lot easier with machinery. And I mean, if you tracked the horsepower requirement or needs of our business over the years, we started with grey Fergies, which were only about 100 horsepower in the 50s, and we're now up to 250 horsepower tractors, for doing our job and lifting the trees and so on. So we've made light of the work with machinery, but we haven't changed the grafting and budding and the propagation techniques we use. We're very similar to my grandfather's time.
Oh, that's really good to hear. And I suppose, I suppose with modern sort of techniques, that sort of moved on as well.
Oh, yes. But how do you measure progress? Do you measure it in horsepower, or do you measure it in plant propagation? But there are some useful propagation techniques we're utilizing under glass and micropropagation and things like that these days. So there are some interesting progress. Yeah, there is some interesting progress.
Yeah, so I suppose bringing your sort of story sort of up to date with the evolution of the growing business now. You mentioned, the likes of micropropagation. I mean, many of our podcast listeners will probably understand that term from perhaps the world of houseplants, because obviously a lot of those are now micropropagated, things like orchids. So just, on a bit of a sidetrack, I mean, how does that affect your production of your trees?
Well, funny enough, we use it in our business mostly for propagating rootstocks. And the rootstock is the root system of all trees, be it fruit trees or ornamental trees. But in this instance, particularly with fruit, some of the newer rootstocks, which are using on the commercial side of the fruit industry, are only produced from tissue culture or micropropagation. So that's where it fits into our current program. Yeah.
That's really, really interesting. So, obviously, Frank P. Matthews supply, goodness knows, I don't know how many UK garden centres, obviously including us at Buckingham here, with ornamental fruit trees and obviously fruit trees for ornamental use too. But I suppose, Nick, how do you know what to grow? I mean, what's the sort of process of deciding what to grow?
That's a good question. We have quite a dilemma in that, because we're propagating 2 to 3 years before we sell trees. That's a normal production cycle of what we do. So we don't have the benefit of turning a conveyor system on and off according to demand. So we have to predict it, or try and predict it as best we can. I actually work on the 80-20 principle, that 80% of what we have always grown will probably be in demand in the future, and the other 20% is the challenge of where we go. Either it's introducing new varieties, new species, or whatever, but we're not badly connected to trend, I think. I could ask you that question from your business. You probably stock most of the trees you've always been able to sell, because you feel that there's a good chance people will ask for those varieties. And I think we work very similarly. Yeah.
Yes, I quite agree. And although you do find sort of trends, interestingly, laburnum trees, I mean, back in the 1950s and 60s, but please correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, but I mean, they were incredibly popular. Everybody wanted to grow a laburnum. Now, of course, they are available in different formats, but because of course the issues with the poisonous seeds and issues with obviously young children and the issues of the whole area of plant toxicity, they've sort of gone out of favour. I suppose that's an example I can sort of probably draw from.
Yes, you're right. But it's a gradual process. You don't see, these things don't actually happen overnight. Occasionally, because of the ability for messages to go out these days instantly, we are seeing that trends are moving faster. Everything's moving faster. And of course, that's reliant on information, which is so much better. But even so, with trees are long-term. You plant them for years to come, generations ahead. So I think possibly people are a little bit more discerning than we would perhaps give them credit for. Yeah. And I find that people who are interested in trees very much look on the long term when they're planting.
Yeah, most definitely. I totally agree there. So on the nursery, Nick, how are the trees grown? Does everything start effectively in the soil before it's containerized? Could you just sort of explain that sort of process to us?
Yes, of course. Yes. Well, when we came here, we only ever produced trees in the soil, and that continued until about the mid-80s, when we started putting trees into containers for our customers like yourself, and that was the way things moved. But to produce the trees in pots, we have to grow 50, I would think 60% of them start as young trees in the soil. And that's, we are growing 250,000 trees a year in the field production, and the majority of those will go into containers the following year to increase their size and shape, to make them presentable for people to plant in gardens as a finished tree. So it's still, the field production is still incredibly important. In addition to that, we have what we call a bench grafting, summer grafting program, where we will graft trees onto rootstocks, bare root in the winter, on young cell-grown rootstocks in the summer. And these are all the difficult subjects. And that's increasing as we enter into a wider range of trees with more difficult to propagate subjects. We're using summer propagation in containers, and these young trees never go into the field. They'll just be potted on over 2 years to finish at the same size and availability as the bare root would have started in the field. So we're mixing and matching both propagation techniques and methods. Yes.
Yeah, it certainly helps. And notice obviously when your trees arrive, I mean, we always really look forward to the main delivery sort of in September. There's always a sense of anticipation because yes, there's obviously new varieties amongst the popular favourites as well. But one thing it is important, I suppose, is to stress that trees these days are sort of a bit of a commodity. People come to the garden centre and almost sort of in many ways sort of maybe impulse buy. They've got an idea, they've got a space to fill in the garden. I had a customer literally over this weekend who wanted to grow some lovely oak trees, so they'd seen this new variety called Green Pillar, and it fitted their situation, and they bought two trees which they could actually fit in their car, which is obviously quite an important consideration when you buy something from a garden centre, which is not too big. So is that another consideration on the growing side of your container trees, the size and the training of them?
Yes, very much so. We're very aware of exactly what you said, that people need to be able to take them home fairly conveniently in cars. So you're probably very skillful at putting a large tree in a small car. I think that's one of your great skills. But we have to bear that in mind. Transport, the age of tree mustn't be too old, not too big, for practical reasons for getting it to people in gardens. So we are a little bit limited on age and size to what we produce, but with careful training and pruning and summer pruning in the nursery here, we generally contain trees to under 2 meters and across the whole range of fruit and ornamental trees. Yes.
Yeah. Going on to a slightly different subject, Nick. Obviously, we're seeing the effects of climate change, obviously, with what's been going on in the big world out there. How's that sort of impacting on the nursery? How are you finding that, whether it's the plants you're growing?
Less the plants, well, the trees that we're growing, more so how we are growing it and what the threats are to our growing cycle. We happen to live on a river here. It gives us great benefit, but occasionally it bites us back. And we've had more floods in recent times, which have threatened parts of the nursery because of where we are. But we accept that. In terms of what we grow, it's a good question. Little has changed. I think I was looking, funny enough, the other day at what were our catalogue now to what it might have been 20, 25 years ago. And there is very little change in genera and species that we're offering because we are essentially growing hardy nursery stock. And it's hardy for a purpose. We do delve a little bit into more tender trees, occasionally things like albesias, acacias, which are lovely tropical type looking trees, but essentially they come from parts of the world which have relatively cold winters, or certainly part of the winter is relatively cold. We're affected more by seasonal frosts, late frosts, but that can affect fruit trees on the flower. But if you ask me, hopefully I've answered that question, and not a lot has changed in terms of what we offer and the hardiness rating of them, because we are not. Let me give you a great example of this. If anyone walks around arboretums in this country, they're full of a huge range of genera and species of trees and shrubs from all over the world. In fact, our gardens are, certainly from an ornamental perspective, derived up to 50% from plants that have come from China and in that area of the world and North America. So we're very much glued to the plants that have come from that region, which have a very, very cold winters. So we're not affected too much by climate change, no.
No, that's really good. It puts a complete perspective on that point, Nick. on that side of this, and when I was talking about climate change as well, I was thinking about obviously the peat issue, which is obviously bombarding the whole gardening trade at the moment. And I was just wondering how the nursery was going to be looking at this, in the eyes of the peat-free issue, which is obviously overhanging the horticultural trade at the moment.
Yes, it is. From us, well, there's two aspects here. One is we should be, and it shouldn't cost anyone to reduce the use of peat in gardens as a product for mulching and so on. I think everyone would probably agree that's not fundamentally necessary. You can produce organic matter with other materials for gardens. So, but from a production perspective, there is a minority of plants that do require a particular type of medium to grow successfully high quality, good plants for people to grow to take home. And this would be mostly the ericaceous subjects. We don't grow a lot of ericaceous trees required in this nursery, and 95% of our compost is peat-free. So we're on bark and other materials, a little bit, and some coir. But coir also has an environmental impact, so we have to be a little bit careful what we use in all regards to mediums. But my only appeal would be that specialist propagators and growers who only require a very small amount of peat in the bigger picture should be allowed perhaps to do that under a license so that their livelihoods are not threatened. But I think the majority of the volumes of what's peat that's been used in the past could quite easily be phased out. I don't think that is a problem, and maybe this is good news to hear that.
Yes, most definitely, yes. And of course we've got to look at across the water to our European growers as well to see how they're going to take the initiatives in this new peat-free world we're expected to adapt to. So it's all good. On the aspect, Nick, of choosing trees for the garden, obviously one thing which obviously Frank P. Matthews is well known for is labelling and giving really good instructive information. But when it comes to choosing garden trees, have you any particular sort of hints and tips to help our podcast listeners on that journey?
Well, yes, without sort of mentioning specifics, one of the very important aspects of choosing a tree is to match it with your soil type. Too often we forget about how important the soil is. We look at obviously what we like in terms of plant material, what we might fancy, but it's important that we're aware of your basic soil. Is it alkaline, acid? Is it well drained? Do you have drainage issues? And one of the tips I often say is, well, have a look over the hedge. Mm-hmm. Walk around your area, see what thrives, have a word with the neighbours. If you've just moved into a new house, talk to people that have lived there for some years about and their gardens and what suits and so on. You'll get a very good idea. I think the conclusion will be that there is a huge range of plant material that would be suitable for most gardens, but you just have to think a little bit about the soil.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. That's really, really good advice, Nick. Probably those people who are buying houses now with much smaller plots. I mean, this is the biggest question we sort of get asked at the garden centre these days is obviously small gardens, small plots, but the people still want to grow a tree. Any thoughts, any recommendations there?
Well, yes, I think what I would say, firstly, is that in any garden, if you can mix edibles with ornamentals together, you'll have an enriched plant material that will satisfy you all through the year. So I don't think you can do one or t'other, or necessarily choose one over the other. But if you could mix both, even if they're shrubby soft fruit plants or dwarf acers, you can. There's a way of mixing and matching even in the smallest space. Some really quite beautiful and functional plants. So first of all, I would try and keep space and have an open mind about mixing both those two types, especially for family, grow your own trends and so on. You always want to leave a little space for some edibles. That would be a good thing. When it comes to tree size, you have to be careful. It's very possible that small trees can be grown as shrubs with careful pruning and training, and reverse. Shrubs could be turned into little trees if their lower branches are removed, so you can plant other plant material underneath. And you really want to have light canopy trees and shrubs in small gardens, and then you don't have too much shading. Dwarf conifers, I think, are coming a little bit more back into fashion. I think they offer a nice contrast, certainly for the winter. And the use of dwarf rootstocks for trees, fruit trees, the training of trees. If you can adapt the spur pruning techniques on fruit trees, you can put a lot of different varieties into a small space, and it's worth exploring that avenue. But I think we have such a wonderful plant range to choose from. It can be possible to be very creative and have a lot of different plants represented in your garden, even in a small space.
Yeah, most definitely. I think what you're saying about sort of keeping shrubs into smaller trees is probably sometimes the way to go. I mean, certainly coppicing and reducing back trees seems to work. Yeah. Things like Amelanchias, I know, are very popular with our customers, and obviously they lend themselves to being sort of hacked back and nicely creating a good shaped tree, which for the small garden's perfect. When it comes to spring interest, Nick, I mean, obviously we tend to always think about obviously flowering cherries, but what's your thoughts on good doers for the springtime in gardens?
Well, you mentioned Amelanchia. I think it's a lovely ornamental tree. Some of them have a bit of fruit as well, but we'll come on to that. They're related to the Saskatoon family. Mm-hmm. You've mentioned Prunus. Prunus is a wonderful range of spring flowering trees, which spreads over up to 5 months. Some of the earliest flowering Prunus, which includes the almond family, the apricot family, and the Fuji cherries, which flower early in the spring, which are very, very low-growing, small flowering cherries. So you needn't plant necessarily the big Japanese flowering cherries. You can go for the Prunus incisor types, which give you a much smaller tree, and they have wonderful impact with flower. But if you look at Prunus, if you just took one range, I would say look at the Prunus family, and also look at the Malus family, the crab apples. They are wonderful and worthy trees that give you flower, some now interesting foliage and fruit in the autumn as well. But you can combine Prunus and Malus very well in gardens, and the Prunus will precede and flower after the Malus, and the Malus flower over about a month, where Prunus will overlap either side of the Malus flowering season. So those two I would certainly concentrate on.
Oh, good selections there. When it comes to, I was saying about the smaller garden issue, but screening, putting something to sort of block the view out of an unwanted view from a window, is the perennial question. And I mean, certainly at the garden centre here, we do sort of normally mention betulas, good old birch. Normally one of the Himalayan varieties, just to keep it looking good through the winter. But again, any thoughts on recommendations for that location?
Yes, I think you're right to point out something like birch. We're obviously very aware of the problems with planting evergreen hedges. It can create a lot of bad feeling between neighbours. It can block out a lot of sunlight. They are an issue which has to be carefully considered. You can mix evergreen and deciduous, so you get a more filtering effect for shelter, and you're letting in a lot more light. But birch are good. in that regard, and birch support up to 300 species of insects on that one tree alone. If you think about the environmental benefits of having a mixture of deciduous and coniferous where birds can shelter and so on. So you've got to be a little bit more imaginative. Hornbeam are very good, and they come in fairly upright shapes, and they hold on to their leaves for a considerable time, well into sort of midwinter. So think about hornbeam a little bit. They're not flowering trees, but they're very neat and tidy, and they have shape, and that shapes are important in gardens as well.
Yeah,
I often think pine trees are underutilized rather than the sort of Leyland type and Lawsonian cypress. Pine trees have more filtering. You can remove branches of pine trees so you can let light coming through them. So as long as you take the whole branches back to the main stem and do that periodically, you can create a more topiary effect on pines, and they'll mix in nicely with birch and hornbeam.
Yeah, really good consideration. I didn't think about the pines there, so no, that's a good one to think over. Obviously, you're producing many new plants are coming out through the gardening trade, and I always used to look forward to, obviously in the gardening trade we have a big show in June normally. Obviously through the pandemic it's obviously been curtailed, but the HTA introduce a competition for new plants, and I know that trees obviously feature heavily in that, and I know you've picked up a few awards over the years of those. So, when it comes to the sort of newly introduced trees, is there any you'd like to sort of give a bit of a shout out at this time?
Yes, some. I'll mention a few. One or two that have been really quite recent, but we mustn't forget new ones which have actually proved their worth as well over the last few years. Two Malus varieties I would suggest would be Scarlet, which we introduced about 10, 15 years ago, and more recently one called Aros, which is a very slim, slow-growing fastigiate tree with amazing, almost black trilobed leaves, lovely pink, two-tone pink and white flowers with fruit, and Scarlet, which preceded it. They're both of the Turingo species. That's got a lovely autumn colour. It's a conventional habit, but not too vigorous. And they provide all seasonal interest. More recently, we've introduced in the prunus side, actually in the last 10, 15 years, I would think Chocolate Ice, which is a new Japanese cherry came into the country originally in the 90s, but it takes a while for these things to become established. Chocolate Ice is dynamic in its leaf and flower contrast. One tree that's done incredibly well, which is good value, is Prunus Royal Burgundy. Chris, I'm sure you stock that.
It's a lovely one, yes.
It's a wonderful autumn colour this year. I don't know whether you've noticed in the last few days. It's been absolutely stunning. More recently, this year, we introduced a Cercis called Eternal Flame. Cercis is from North America. We've had a lot of good ones come through into the garden in trade for the last 20 years. It started with forest pansy, and we've got a myriad of different leaf colours and flowers, from white flowers through to intense pink of the Avondale types. But this Eternal Flame, which won the best new plant in Chelsea this last September, is an extraordinary tree. Its leaf is 2 or 3 toned throughout the summer, and it never changes. It just looks like, it's beautifully named actually, Eternal Flame, but it's quite dynamic. The foliage is just stunning. And cerces can be pruned hard. Most people don't. They think they're too delicate, but actually they can be pruned so you can contain them. And I think that would be one certainly for the future.
Yeah, I've seen some pictures of the Cercis Eternal Flame, and a lot of people were saying, "Oh, this could be a really good tree, maybe for growing in containers where people want that real good look of a small garden tree." Would you agree with me, containerising it as a larger potted plant?
Oh yes, no problem at all. The principle of pot growing is there's just some fundamental principles you need to be care of. One is the pot size needs to be increased every few years to keep the root system developing. You've got to obviously water often, and you've got a bit of just extra TLC for anything that's in a pot. But it doesn't start. No, I think it's with care. A tree like Eternal Flame could remain in a pot, increasingly its size, over 20, 25 years. I've got a Malus Red Sentinel I've had in a pot for 30 years.
Oh, wow.
It flowers and fruits every single year, and it's not any larger than about 1.5 meters.
Right. Okay. So there, the proof, as I say, is in the pudding, isn't it? Yes. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah. It is indeed. Yeah. Another good tree to mention is one we introduced this year, which is Magnolia Eileen Baines. It's a double-flowered form of the Wilsonii, which is a summer flowering, as some people will know, with a beautiful scent. So it's got the scent of Wilsonii, but the flower is a double form. Now, it's quite rare. I think that's something to worth mentioning. And we mustn't forget fruit.
No.
Fruit varieties are becoming extremely interesting. The one apple two apples I would say we've introduced recently, which are worth eating for their beautiful flavour, is Christmas Pippin and Herefordshire Russet. Those are two very fine garden apples which anybody would take a fancy to. There are some interesting what we call cross hybrids, one of which is a Mirabelle called Aprimera, and that is a cross between an apricot and a Mirabelle. An apricot and a plum, and that's called Aprimera. That's a special flavour, tastes like tangerines. So yes, there's always some good new stuff indeed. Good new varieties for everybody.
They do sound exciting. Certainly the Mirabelle fruitings there. On the prospects of somebody, obviously we're at the time of the year when tree planting is sort of rife across the whole country, especially we're thinking about National Tree Planting Week shortly. Any advice to give to somebody who's never planted a tree in the garden, Nick?
Oh, just go out and do it.
Yeah.
I think if you're worried or concerned or nervous, it's just put all those fears to one side and go and plant a tree. It's a most satisfying experience, and the most important thing is to go back and look after it.
Yes, well, that leads on to my next question. Yes, the care, the aftercare, I suppose, is as long as you put them into some reasonably good soil and you've given the plants a bit of nutrition. What's your feeling about putting feed in and planting the planting situation? Is it something you would recommend?
Yes, of course. I think if you're on very good soil, you generally don't need to add very much else to it. The two main principles here are water and weeds. One you have to give a lot of, which is the water, of course, and the weeds you've got to remove from the tree for several years. And grass, which I consider a weed to trees, is one of the most, I think it's one of the most biggest problems for the establishment of trees. Grass absorbs huge amounts of water. It takes competition from developing the young roots of developing trees. And after 3 or 4 years, they're fine. But it's that first 3 or 4 years you need to keep around the tree, underneath. You can plant other plants, obviously, but keep grass and weeds away from the tree. That's so important to getting them established. Once they're up and running, you can ignore that. After a few years, 2 or 3 years, the trees will be fine. They'll look after themselves.
On that sort of principle, Nick, what about sort of annual care? What would you recommend doing to your newly planted tree once a year? Would it be a feed or a bit of sort of trimming or pruning? What's your sort of go-to activity?
Yeah, so yes, a few things. If it's staked and tied, then you must actually go back and loosen the tie periodically. So many trees I've seen that have been staked and tied with good intent initially. You go back a few years and the ties are strangling the trees. So that's number one. You can remove branches, the lower branches certainly, and thin out very thick canopies. That can be done in a timely. We'll get onto that in a moment. And keep the tree mulched. As I said, you've got to keep the weeds and grass away, but mulching helps. And to maintain that mulch, certainly for the first 2 or 3 years, keeps all the moisture in the soil. This will reduce your watering dramatically, but mulching is extremely important.
And your favourite mulching material, if you had to choose?
Oh, I would use anything that is cheap, environmentally friendly, as long as it's well composted. Mm-hmm. If you use bark, which is probably a mistake, anything that's woody, that's got a lot of cellulose in it, in the material, will take a long time to break down. That process takes energy, bacterial activity, and nitrogen from the soil and depletes the use of this for the tree. So use a well composted material as opposed to an uncomposted material.
Yeah, good stuff there. So on the basis of you growing your new tree, any necessary tips on pruning, keeping your trees in the best sort of shape?
Yes, I think generally I find that people don't prune enough. It's mostly fear and perhaps a slight lack of information that they need to encourage them to prune. Pruning pruning does is that it encourages fresh growth. It enhances the characteristics of trees and shrubs, so the leaves are bigger. The autumn colour is better if it's an autumn featured plant. You get larger flowers. You get less pest and disease because the canopy of the tree is more airy. And trees and shrubs are generally much healthier if they are pruned regularly. You don't have to do it every year. Occasionally just need to take some branches out, but don't hesitate. You will never kill a tree or shrub by pruning. And do more than you think, and don't worry about it at all. But there are some golden rules. One is you should always prune in the dry weather. So if you've got 24, maybe hopefully up to 48 hours of dry weather ahead of you, that is a good time to do pruning, because fresh cuts will heal, put a natural seal on themselves after about 24 hours. Up to that point, if you're pruning and it rains and the spores flying around, you can get a little bit more infection coming on to the pruning points. So dry weather is very, very important.
Lovely. On the aspect of, you mentioned before about the use of using fruiting plants in the garden, how important to get that mix in certainly in smaller plots. But do you have any sort of fruiting recommendations, Nick, for smaller gardens where space is perhaps at a bit of a premium?
Yes, I'd probably go for dwarf apples. Apples are very forgiving. They're very rewarding. They're robust trees, and because of the dwarf rootstocks, we can keep them small. I would also consider something like the Saskatoons or the Juneberries. This is the Amelanchier family, actually, which is the fruiting Amelanchiers. They are just like blueberries. The flavour is just as good and similar. And the important things with those is that they don't need acid soil. So the Saskatoons or Jumeries, they're the Amelanchier ornifolia species. They are very robust trees and can grow in any soil conditions. So I'd certainly consider that. If you're in a frost pocket, I'd probably I'd probably just stick to apples and later flowering fruit trees and avoid the peaches and the apricots, which flower very, very early, and the almond family. They're the ones to avoid if you're in a frost area. But very often you can get caught by late frosts where the early frosts don't appear, and you can get a set. So the blossom is only ever vulnerable when it's open as blossom. As soon as it's set fruitlets, it then becomes more resistant to frosts that follow afterwards. So it's not always just one golden rule.
Perfect. Yes, yeah, and certainly this spring we had obviously a very cold April, which I think did hit a lot of fruit. But hopefully those peaches and nectarines avoided it. Nick, we must talk about your book, Trees for Your Garden. I mean, it's literally our go-to reference book here at the Garden Centre in our plant office. Can you tell me a little bit of the inspiration behind it?
Yes, I think it was possibly a lack of appreciation of a wide range of trees that are possible to plant in the garden that inspired me. That there wasn't sufficient information or a reference, an easy reference, to look at, one, how to choose a tree, and secondly, from what range you could choose it from. So the book was written for people who do not know anything about trees. They don't have time in their lives, and they just wanted an easy reference. And it's all done on symbols, as you know in the book. There's a symbol for every type of situation and characteristic, be it native friendly or bird friendly or suitable for acid soils and so on. So you don't have to trawl through huge amounts of information to be able to identify a tree that is perfect for your garden and your garden situation. But it's been well received. It's been well received for certain.
Yeah, well, as I say, it's so useful. Yeah, I mean, it's so useful and so practical. I think that's what people want from a gardening book these days. But no, that's great. Obviously, we're coming into National Tree Planting Week towards the end of November into early December, and of course, it's that big celebration of tree planting. What do you think? Do you think the actual whole campaign of Plant a Tree Week has still got its credence these days, Nick, as an event, or do you think it's perhaps lost its sort of attraction, as we are obviously these days sort of promoting tree planting through much of the autumn and the winter?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's lost its well-intentioned promotion of trees. It's just 1 week in the year where we're all focused on it, perhaps more than at any other time. But it's served its purpose. There are many initiatives right now on planting trees, so perhaps it's slightly overshadowed. But we mustn't forget how important it's been in the past to set up people's thinking, just for 1 week of the year and so on. So no, I think it still has a good use, and there are plenty of threats for as you said, on tree diseases and so on. So any initiative is a good one. Indeed. So no, I think it's still got its place for sure.
Good. Nick, when we're chatting to our podcast guests, we like to put you under the spotlight a bit, and then, as you probably know, the question I'm begging here is if you've been shipwrecked on your virtual desert island and you were just given one tree to plant, what would you grow?
Well, yes, this is a good searching question. I would plant a fruit tree because it provides me with food when I'm sitting on that desert island. I wouldn't waste the opportunity of having a tree that produced fruit as well as shade. Shade would be important. And I've been thinking it's either an apple or a black mulberry. I think I'll go for a black mulberry because it's a challenging tree at the best of times for for picking their fruit, but I'd have all the time in the world. So I would be quite happy to be sitting under a mulberry tree, and enjoying the fruits of the canopy. Yeah.
Yeah, I can picture you there now. Nick, it's been great. Nick, it's been great for your time today and your insights and observations for our podcast. It's been fascinating, and I think one thing we've learned over the years is that legacy and sort of trees go hand in hand. And don't they say that the best time to plant a tree is about 20 years ago?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's more pertinent than ever. So now more than ever, we perhaps need to sort of focus on the important life that sort of trees are providing to our very ever fragile planet. And obviously, with the likes of yourselves and your wonderful work at Frank P. Matthews, you're obviously making that little process somewhat easier for us gardeners. Thanks, Nick, for your time today.
No, not at all. Can I just say one last thing?
Of course.
Just to read you a little bit of part of a poem about trees, which I always thought was quite nice and may interest your viewers. It's Richard. It was written. I put part of it in my book. Actually, it's about said the tree to the man, and said the man to the tree, and said the tree to the man. There has always music for you in my leaves, beauty in my changing colours, nourishment in my fruits. With trees around, no man is comfortless. And secondly, said the man to the tree, I will spare you the light and space that you need, and I will secure that when you are old, another generation will replace you.
Oh, that's lovely. Yes, yeah, that's very pertinent, isn't it? Oh, no, we do like a little bit of poetry on our Dig It podcast, so that's lovely. Thank you. That
was by Elizabeth Barling. That was written by Elizabeth Barling. The author should be known.
Oh yes, most definitely. No, that's really good. Oh well, I think that's put us into a really good mindset for our tree plantings this autumn. And Nick, thank you once again for your time today.
Not at all. It's been a great pleasure. Thanks, Chris. Yeah.
Thank you, Nick.
Well, that was a very interesting conversation, wasn't it, Chris?
Wasn't it just? Nick certainly, he knows his trees, but he knows how to grow them, and I think that you get a great insight on the commercial side of things as well, because we sort of take it for granted. Trees arrive at garden centres and nurseries, but they have to come from somewhere.
They do, don't they? And I never really thought about the idea of using rootstocks to sort of graft different types of trees onto. Is that quite common? I mean, if you... What sort of trees was he referring to there?
Yep, so it would be things like your cherry trees, your mallows, your crab apples, because obviously they need to be on some varieties would need to be on a more vigorous rootstock to encourage the more lackluster variety, like we do with apple trees. So it's a good way of manipulating. But things like some of the sorbus varieties, the mountain ash, they would be grafted. And then, of course, things like the acers, things like Acer brilliantissimum, that lovely sort of flamingo pink-flowered variety we get in, that's what they call top grafted. So you have a long stem of rootstock, effectively, where it's actually then grafted with that, usually that waxing at the top of the plant as well. And, of course, willows, of course, are all some of the decorative willows, like the Kilmarnock willow, that would be grafted too.
Makes sense.
It's essential to keep the plants nicely, to implore their vigour, and sometimes keep them a little bit more restricted too.
Yeah, because I suppose you can do, like you say, sort of either put them onto a rootstock that restricts them, or put them onto a rootstock that gives them even more vigour. So if it's a smaller plant, it then grows even bigger and better.
Yeah, and I suppose thinking about Japanese maple trees, which we sell a lot of, which obviously are more specific to ericaceous soil, which you might not put in your garden, they're obviously grafted too. So they generally have those wonderful pink and red and amazing coloured leaves, but if you think about it, not a lot of chlorophyll to support the growth. So they need to be on a nice vigorous rootstock to support that growth.
Okay. So Chris, just thinking a bit laterally here, can I ask a silly question?
Of course you can.
Is it possible to graft an ericaceous plant onto a lime-tolerant rootstock?
It is, and it has been done, and it is being done as we speak. So there is a rhododendron which gardeners can buy called the Incara rhododendron.
Yep, I've seen them.
Yep, and they're usually nice and compact, so good for smaller gardens.
Yep.
Usually a good colour range. However, they were found, the Incara rootstock was found in Germany, and it was on a very limey quarry, which, of course, you wouldn't expect a rhododendron to be growing on.
Not
of course.
in a lime quarry, no.
It was in that area. So what the German growers did, they took the plants back to a nursery, they propagated the plants on.
Right.
They did a bit of good old micropropagation to bulk up the stock.
Yeah.
And then they basically grafted varieties of rhododendrons which are acid-loving onto a rootstock which was tolerant of lime.
Wow. That's
And
quite clever, isn't
That
it?
happened probably about 20, maybe 25 years ago. I remember the news story breaking, so it was probably in the late 80s, early 90s. And the sort of key thing is that this is going to revolutionise the way you can grow rhododendrons. It means everybody now can grow a rhododendron in their soil.
Without having to plant it in a big dustbin or something like that.
Indeed,
That's really cool.
And they are popular, and certainly you'll find those Incara rhododendrons, named varieties. They've got a big label. They're nicely branded, so you can't miss them. Usually coloured pots as well. Although I suspect they'll probably go to taupe pots because of the environmental now.
More recyclable.
Indeed, with the logo, and they're usually available in the spring. So something to look out for if you're wanting something to give that rhododendron look in your clay alkaline soils.
Excellent. Obviously, all this talk of trees, Chris. Have you got a favourite tree?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, when I posed the question for us both to answer, I thought, actually, this is not such an easy one, isn't it? But I think my favourite at this time of the year is the birch tree.
Okay.
I've got two in my garden. I've got a white-stemmed birch, which is a youngster, and I've got the pendulous, the Youngii birch, which is the weeping birch. The weeping birch has been in now 20 years, exactly, because I've been in the house that long, and it's mature. It doesn't grow any taller.
Yeah, because they don't get too enormous, but they do have a lovely shape, don't they? And in the winter, you get to see all the bark, and I mean, they are really beautiful trees, and I can see why you like that one.
Architecturally, yes. Now the leaves have dropped, it looks really good, and it's great because the local bird life used to use it as a perch. Top as well. So I often have interesting conversations from my bedroom window with the local pigeons as they tend to go there. And one year they did try and build a nest right at the top of this tree, which is absolutely manic, and it didn't last very long, unfortunately.
I was going to say they're quite dainty trees, aren't they?
They are.
They're quite strong, but they always look very delicate and sort of not quite suitable for a big old pigeon's nest.
No. But for smaller gardens, they're great. And if you want to diffuse, like Nick was saying about diffusing visions of screening in your garden, they're really good for that as well. So if you've got a slightly nosy neighbour or prying eyes, a pendulous birch in your garden, as long as it's probably 30, 40 foot away from your house, I would say, you would be absolutely fine. I wouldn't plant it any closer than that. And the good thing as well, it has quite a nice attractive bark as well. It's not white like the Himalayan birch, but it's quite attractive, and it's got those lovely catkins as well. So that would be my good old desert island.
That's your desert island tree, is it?
And for all the, hopefully, for environmental reasons, and also the fact it's a very practical tree too.
Excellent.
And yours, Peter?
Like you, Chris, I had a similar dilemma here. I was thinking about this morning, and it's like there's just so many different types of tree, aren't there? I mean, you've got the conifers, which a nice blue spruce or something like that can really look nice, and then you've got the sort of African trees with the lovely canopies that they create, and just sort of all the tropical palms and things like that, which they're all just so diverse in shapes and forms. But it's something my grandfather did that really amused me. He, as you may know, he came from London and loved growing things, and they had a relatively small house and a small garden. But he loved horse chestnut trees.
Oh, right.
So, obviously, horse chestnuts are not a small tree, are they?
Certainly not. Not the last time I looked.
So, he bonsai'd a horse chestnut in his front garden, and basically every year went round cutting the roots out, and every sort of couple of years he'd dig out half of the roots and put new compost and new soil in so the plant could grow out and make it. So it had a good space to grow into, but every year obviously got massively chopped back. And he managed to keep that to about 10, 15 foot and grew it for quite a few years. And then I don't know what happened to it when he moved out, because I'm not entirely sure he told the people who bought the house that it was...
That'll be a nice surprise in 20 years' time.
So, yeah, it probably didn't last that much longer after he moved out. But I thought that's a wonderful way to have a tree that would normally grow, 100 foot tall, and keep it as a much, much smaller specimen, but obviously requires an awful lot more care and a lot more watering and a lot more nurturing, but it can be done. And I thought that's a good story to share with you all. But with regards to my favourite tree, I think I'm going to pick a hawthorn.
Okay.
Just because when you see them as trees, they're just so sort of gnarly, and they're not that big. They've got the lovely red berries and they flower in the spring. But yeah, they're just they're not a common tree. You generally obviously find them in hedgerows. So that would be my tree of choice. It's something a bit different. It's a bit spiky, but
and it's native, isn't it? And that's a good thing to encourage people to grow. And of course, it's going to tick all the boxes for wildlife too. So,
and they don't have massive leaves, so they're not like some trees that are going to fill your garden with leaves. And as Nick was saying, and you say they're a native tree and they do grow well in this country.
Yeah.
So
good choice.
I'm going to go with a hawthorn or a quickthorn.
Perfect.
So wasn't it great that Brazil have decided to jump the gun on the deforestation commitment and have said that they're creating a new national park and they're going to be trying to reverse deforestation from effectively today rather than waiting for a couple of years to do it.
Yeah, that's so good to hear. I mean, and when you were watching all those reports from Glasgow, wasn't it? It was like, well, can't you start really today? Why does it have to be a 5, 10, 15, or a decade's plan when obviously the Earth is in so much need of change to the best? But 2030 was the date they'd set, hasn't it? So if they can do it a couple of years earlier than that would be even better.
That's it. And I love this idea of sort of creating ribbons of forest and natural sort of space where the insects and birds and things can grow. And I heard of one recently, a wildlife corridor from Leeds to Lincoln, which I think is a brilliant idea, just sort of creating these long connected chains of natural habitat so that everything can thrive and still grow. Because I know there's a lot of monoculture in this country, and personally I can understand why farmers want to grow oilseed rape and not diversify, because they can make a living at it just about. But the idea of having these corridors to still keep the nature and the bugs and the bees and all of those sort of things, giving them somewhere to live as well, it's very important, isn't it?
Most definitely. I was watching a documentary last night on the TV looking at the Lake District, and they were showing mass deforestation of Sycra spruce.
Okay.
And the presenter just said, well, this is terrible. You're removing all this, but the reason is it is grown as a crop, so they're actually manufacturing it for timber. However, the problem is in large areas, especially in the Lake District in Derbyshire, you've got monoculture trees planted. Yep. Of course, that is not good news if you get a problem with a disease or a pest. So it's all going to be replanted with a rich, diverse biodiversity of trees. So instead of one species, there'll be probably a dozen.
Yeah, which is it makes it. I always think it looks nicer as well if there's nothing else. Yeah. And I think that's one of the commitments that we must really try and strive towards with this new idea of everyone, sort of the Queen getting behind us all planting trees and giving us grants to do that. Is obviously Dutch elm disease, all of these diseases that have come in from abroad because we've been bringing trees in. Yep. It's very important to try and support our local tree growers and our native tree growers, because obviously they're growing stock that hasn't got any of these pests and diseases. So that's something to bear in mind.
Most definitely. I think people like the Forestry Commission now are really looking up in their ante as far as making sure that that happens. And now we've got more biosecurity in this country. We're setting our own precedents rather than being sort of slightly dictated to as we were in the previous regime of
pre-Brexit.
Pre-Brexit, that's the word. Then we're in a different sort of situation now. But yes, the Queen's Green Canopy campaign will be good for next year. And obviously the idea of that is to basically create a unique planting opportunities across the whole of the UK through 2022 under Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee. So I think that in itself will produce a wonderful legacy, won't it, for years to come on the back of that as well.
And the other thing I always think about when you're looking at, I know, Christmas trees, they're a crop that is grown as a tree crop, and you think, well, that must be doing some good for the environment in the sense of it's creating nice spaces. But yeah, they are a bit of a monoculture. But then equally, I know at the garden centre here, we have a policy where we support a local charity, Ripple, and for every Christmas tree we sell, another tree is planted out in Africa. Yeah. And hopefully that helps reforestation in another continent. So not only do you buy a tree and effectively have another one planted by the Christmas tree grower, you're getting a little bit of a benefit in another country as well.
That's certainly good for the good old carbon footprint. And as well, I suppose at the end of the day, people are now looking at their artificial Christmas trees in different light, perhaps, because of that. And
well, I've not seen a recycled plastic Christmas tree yet. I hope we do get one soon. I mean, we're getting a lot of furniture now coming through that is made of recycled plastic. And I know there's one brand that's all ocean plastic, which is a really good thing to do with it. So, yeah, hopefully in a few years' time we'll get recycled plastic trees.
Even better, yes. So, Peter, I suppose it's worth giving a little reminder that it's National Tree Planting Week from the 27th of November through to the 5th of December.
Yeah, so out with your spades.
Yeah, started back in 1972, Tree Planting Week. Okay. And I think the slogan was plant some trees in 72, plant some more in 73. I think it had a little bit of a rhythm going on. Okay. But of course, Tree Planting Week started because, of course, the Dutch elm disease problems of the 1960s, and this was a good way of the gardening trade and everybody looking in and planting trees to replace the Dutch elm disease. So its pertinence and its heritage is very ingrained in that. So obviously we've got more issues with diseases these days. So long may it continue in some form or other.
Well, that's it. And I think, like we were discussing earlier, trees aren't for tomorrow, they're for 10 years down the line, aren't they? It's always lovely watching them grow, but they do take a few years.
Totally. And you know what, when you go around any, a lot of the National Trust properties, especially anything designed by, Capability Brown, remember he planted saplings and he never ever saw the results which we so enjoy now when you walk across, Blenheim Palace, Stowe Gardens, you see those trees and you think, my word, that was a visionary, wasn't it? And that's exactly what we do when we plant our humble trees in our gardens. We're having to be a bit of a visionary.
Or you could look at it, you're altruistic and you're giving something to the future, and I think that's
so much better. Yes,
a nice way to look at it.
Indeed,
as well, yeah. Obviously, in the middle of November now, so coming up soon. What's going on in December?
So December, running up to that time of the year again. So we're going to be looking at Christmas trees. Obviously, there will be a few tasks of the month, and we'll also be looking at our links to a national charity and how that can impact the way we buy our Christmas trees.
Okay. Brilliant. I'll look forward to that then, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Chris.
Today's show was brought to you by Buckingham Garden Centre and Nurseries. The show was hosted by Chris Day and Peter Brown. The show was produced by Peter Brown. And our thanks to Chiltern Music Therapy for providing the music. Thanks for listening.
At Chiltern Music Therapy, we want everyone to know the difference that music can make in their lives. From parents and their premature babies in hospital to grandparents with dementia. We provide music therapy and community music services to people of all ages and needs across England. We work both digitally and in person in people's homes, care homes, schools, hospitals and hospices. Find out more at chilternmusictherapy.co.uk.